Today we're talking about Johann Sebastian Bach. He was born March 21st, 1685 in Eisenach, Germany. Bach was a late Baroque composer. Isabella Leonarda was more of a middle Baroque composer. And to give you an example, Monteverdi, who was born in the late 1500s, would have been early Baroque. Robert Schumann, who was born in 1810 of the Romantic era, said of him, "Music owes as much to him as religion to its founder." He also said, "We are all bunglers next to him." His music was studied by the great composers. Frédéric Chopin knew 48 of Bach's preludes and fugues by heart, and if you've ever heard Bach's fugues, that is quite an undertaking. Mozart knew who Bach was. Mozart, like Chopin, studied the preludes and the fugues, among other things. Beethoven also liked Bach. Some of Bach's influence can be heard in his string quartets, and he wrote some very good ones. Bach was not an inventor, but an innovator. For example, the music of Isabella Leonarda came before Bach. She was composing 15 years before he was born. And, we have an early Baroque, a middle Baroque, and a late Baroque, and Bach was late Baroque, and it should be considered that he was able to draw on all of the influences of the Baroque composers that came before him. The thing is, though, is that he perfected all of those forms. He perfected things like the fugue, the mass, the concerto grosso, and the oratorio. So Bach's fugues speak for themselves. They're just called fugues. His famous mass is the Mass in B minor. His concerto grossos are the Brandenburg concertos. You've probably heard of those. And they are the pieces you're most likely to play as orchestra students, if it's something by Bach. As far as an oratorio, his most famous one is the St. Matthew Passion, but he wrote several. He brought whatever musical form he touched to its ultimate development. Furthermore, he did things with music that no one had conceived of, and did it better than anyone else since. Golding. Bach's parents were musical people, and his family name Bach was synonymous with music in Germany. If I'm remembering this right, I think that at one point there were something like 30 Bachs in different churches around Germany. He might not have known them all, but it was a famous name. His parents died when he was 9 or 10, and he was sent to live with his brother. By his brother, he was considered a burden. He was just kind of considered one more mouth to feed, one more pain in the neck. Often Bach was just neglected and forgot about. But his brother was a church organist, and Bach was able to observe that. And his interest in music, which had started very young, was able to continue as a result. And this is where he just started to learn as much as he could about music. Bach traveled all over Europe in his younger years, learning absolutely everything he could about music. He would often travel by foot and be gone for long periods of time for the sole purpose of seeing live music performed. Sometimes he got in trouble with his job because of being away for longer than he said he would be. Later in life, the majority of Bach's compositions were written as part of whatever job he held at the time. At one point, he was in charge of the music of 4 different churches, and this fact speaks to his creative output. Bach composed over 1,000 pieces of music that we know of. Bach was not a traveling man of the world like G.F. Handel. He didn't even travel out of Germany more than a few times in his life, and he stayed within a relatively small circle. Though very skilled, Bach's music fell out of favor in his later years. This is one of the reasons that people weren't that familiar with him. He was known, but he wasn't world famous in his lifetime. He was buried in a simple grave, wasn't marked in any ornate way. It was a hospital cemetery. He wasn't given anything fancy like a funeral or a parade. Bach was somewhat known. He influenced a lot of composers after all, but it wasn't world famous and appreciated for the genius that he was until 80 years after his death. And then in 1829, Felix Mendelssohn performed Bach's St. Matthew Passion, and this began what would eventually redefine Bach as the greatest music genius of all time. Eventually, Bach's body was laid to rest at Thomaskirch in Germany, although this was many, many decades after his death. It was a way of honoring him, much like George Frederick Handel, who was buried at Westminster Abbey. These are your 6 essential Bach facts. You need to know he was a German composer. You need to know that Bach wrote organ music, instrumental music, and vocal music. That should be easy enough to remember if you've heard 1 or 2 of his compositions. Bach worked mainly in churches, and I'm going to say that's another probably easy thing to remember during this time, because that's what most people did when they were musicians like Bach. He perfected the music of the time. It's important to know that because that's why he's number 1 on the best composer lists. He inspired many famous composers later on. As we talked about, he inspired people like Robert Schumann and Mozart, and these are famous composers. We're going to talk about both of them. He was not widely known until about 80 years after his death. So those are your 6 essential Bach facts that you need to know. Everything else in this presentation you can, remember if you're really into Bach and you really want to immerse yourself in this culture, but if you don't, then here are your 6 facts. These are your 4 Bach pieces that I'm going to give you examples of that you can listen to. The Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 is just one of 6 Brandenburg concertos. Toccata and Fugue in D minor is the piece that everybody knew from Bach when I played it in class. Concerto in D minor for 2 violins is another good example of hearing polyphony at work. And the St. Matthew Passion is probably one of the most famous oratorios, second only to the Handel Messiah. This is a recommended listening list. And if you want to check out more Bach, these are some of the best examples and would give you the broadest scope of the things that he did. Thank you for listening, and go ahead and watch those Bach videos. And I'll see you in class.